Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Christine Brown. I work here in the Outreach and Education program, and I am excited to introduce Ken Robison, who will be talking about a selection of stories, fascinating stories from his new book, Cold War Montana. Ken is from Great Falls. He's the historian at the Overholzer Historical Center in Fort Benton, and a very long-time historian and author of 10 books. Are we up to 10?
At least.
Something like that. He also serves on the Sun River Valley Historical Society, the Great Falls Cascade County Preservation Commission, the Big Sky Country National Heritage Area, and he's on our very own Montana Historical Society Board of Trustees. So, without further to-do, Ken Robison.
Thank you, Christine. So did the Bobcats and Grizz win? They're both playing at 1 o'clock. Great to be with you, and it's always great to be here in our Montana History Center. And I'll be sharing some thoughts I have on the Cold War, and I'll be looking forward to some questions and some of your thoughts as well. That was the profound struggle that many of us lived through. It lasted almost half a century from the end of World War II to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'll have to show you an artifact as I begin. I'd pass it around, but it's a little sharp on the edges. This is a Soviet AAA anti-aircraft artillery shell that embedded in the side of a DC-8 in the spring of 1975 as American civilian pilots were flying Tiger flights from Saigon into Phnom Penh, Cambodia, as the Khmer Rouge were circling Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, and about to take over and about to begin their millions of deaths after their takeover. This shell embedded in that DC-8, and it's actually photo of it held by Joe Passini, who was the pilot of that DC-8 in this book, Flying Tigers over Cambodia. I'll pass it around, and I think I've got the page marked. And the first talk I gave about the Cold War Montana, this came to greet me. And it had been brought back from Saigon before it fell as well by Joe Passini, the pilot, who for very strange reasons wound up living the last 25 years or so of his life in Geraldine, Montana. You never know the Montana connection to things, and that was one of the great fun things about doing this book. I had served in the Navy for almost 30 years, and so I knew the Cold War story. I'd been parts of it in different places around the world, but I didn't know what was going on in Montana. And so finding those stories out and the participants here in Montana was great fun. And I really wrote the book for those among the younger generation that probably think the Cold War is ancient history, if they've heard of it at all. And yet they're about to take over leadership of our country. And if they don't understand how that Cold War remained cold and didn't turn into a nuclear holocaust, shame on them. They need to know, especially with the world we live in, with communist China seeming to be poised as our next adversary in another Cold War. But Cold War Montana is really about the history of the Cold War as lived and spoken by Montanans, and I do that for Montanans here in the state as well as those of us that were around the world. Fair question is, what was the Cold War? Many of you certainly know, but it was a titanic life and death struggle that developed as World War II ended between the nuclear-armed United States and our allies and the soon-to-be nuclear-armed Soviet Union. And it was all about the standoff between the U.S. and Soviet Union and stopping the spread of international communism, proselytizing that communist philosophy was Joe Stalin's primary aim at the, well, number one aim for him was always security, but right after that was spreading communism in Europe and around the world. So the Cold War was waged on political, economic, and propaganda fronts with clashing ideologies and cultures as the world teetered on the brink of the Third World War, leading potentially to a nuclear exchange of catastrophic proportions. Corps Montana is that story told by Montanans, but it's a war that we won in two ways. The first, of course, is that it never became a hot war, thank goodness. It remained a Cold War. Second, we won. The Soviet Union collapsed. They banned the Communist Party. And many of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as many of the republics of the former Soviet Union, were rid of their communist governments and able to attain varying degrees of freedom, not all a large degree, but most a fair degree. Indeed, every Montanan, man, woman, and child had lived through and participated in this Cold War in many ways, whether practicing civil defense drills, ducking under your desk, and other measures to save you from nuclear attack, hearing air raid sirens around your towns, building radiation fallout shelters or seeing your neighbors do that, serving in the Ground Observer Corps. Some 11,000 Montanans during the 1950s were part of that very active program that the Air Force used to get by until they had the technology and the radar detection systems like the Future Distant Early Warning and so on, because the threat that was perceived in the late 40s and the 1950s were massive numbers of Soviet bombers armed with nuclear weapons coming over the horizon from the north. And of course, many Montanans joined me in serving either with government agencies or with the military around the world. But Montana played a really surprising role. Although far distant from Moscow and Washington, D.C., the state's broad spaces, clear big sky, and thin population made Montana a vital part of the country's Cold War strategy. The Cold War really began during World War II with the Lend-Lease program and Soviet covert spying centered on Great Falls. It moved on from there to Soviet military occupation of Central and Eastern European countries as they pushed the Germans back late in the war. And of course, with the huge ethnic groups we had in Butte and Anaconda and Great Falls, matter of fact, in World War I, it was something like 2 out of 3 Montanans were either immigrants or the sons and daughters of immigrants. So by World War II, that was a little bit diluted, but it wasn't much. And the interest in what was happening in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and those countries that were being taken over by the Soviet Union in Montana was great. In 1946, heroic Winston Churchill issued his clarion call in his brilliant speech at Fulton, Missouri, warning that an iron curtain was descending on Europe. Now, responding to Churchill's speech, broad range of response. Many newspaper editors and many politicians heralded that speech as recognition of the increasing Soviet domination of Europe and the threat of communism and so on. But our old irascible Senator Burton Wheeler, who deposed U.S. entry in World War II, declared, quote, "Instead of making Europe safe for democracy, we seem to have made it safe for communism." As post-war communist pressure threatened Western Europe, and Greece was threatening to move behind the rapidly descending Iron Curtain, U.S. policy responded. George Kennan, a diplomat in Moscow, wrote a brilliant long telegram proposing that U.S. policy must be to contain Soviet expansion. Then President Truman acted decisively in aiding Greece put down a communist uprising and launched the massive Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe, Western Europe. It's fascinating that each step along the way, Montanans were playing key roles. And these, as I mentioned before, are the stories that I absolutely love to find and share with you all. Before we leave this cover of Cold War Montana, let me talk briefly about the photos. They were selected because they all had a direct connection with Montana and were important. In the upper left is Colonel Fred Vancheri. He was the senior black prisoner of war, shot down, held by the Vietnamese, and he represents, along with many stories in my book, the proxy wars of Korea and Vietnam. The Minuteman II test firing in the center represents the space race and the race for intercontinental ballistic missiles between the US and the Soviet Union. And of course, in the upper right is Colonel Einar Malmström, sons of Swedish immigrants, who served in Great Falls, the Great Falls Air Base, for less than a year, and yet had captured the love and respect of both everyone at the air base and in the communities, so much so that by within 2 weeks of his death, in a plane crash, a movement started to rename Great Falls Air Force Base Malmström Air Base. And the bottom is a photo I absolutely love. It's a little hard for you to see from here, but President John F. Kennedy's on the right. He was visiting first Billings and then the next day Great Falls in September of 1963. Here he is at the high school stadium in Great Falls with a crowd of over 20,000, and this 7-year-old Luke Flaherty is handing him a small model of Kennedy's PT-109 patrol boat from World War II days. A little Christmas magic never hurts, and magic is what the delegation from Great Falls needed just after Christmas of 1941 as they arrived at wartime Washington, D.C. After a decade of hard work by the Chamber of Commerce and several favorable Army surveys, Great Falls expected to receive one of the new Army air bases that was being built around the country. And yet, as they stepped off their aircraft, they received the news that their plan, that the Army Air Corps plan for a base at Great Falls, Montana, had been put in the dead file, and that it was not going to happen. Well, Mayor Ed Shields who we could talk about the rest of the afternoon, a delightful Irish leader in Great Falls, and his delegation were determined, and they managed to receive an audience with the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps, Hap Arnold. He granted an interview to those men from Great Falls and listened intently as they relayed their story and their arguments for the base. And in their presence, he ordered his staff to pull that study out of the dead file and reconsider it. Now, months passed. Wartime secrecy prevailed. But at last, word came 4 months later in April of 42 that an air base would be constructed at Great Falls with satellite air bases at Glasgow, Lewistown, and Cutbank. Now just think if that plan had remained in the Army Air Corps dead file and there had been no bases in Montana during World War II, would Minuteman missiles have followed later in the Cold War? Probably not. But soon more great news arrived. In June, Great Falls was notified that Gore Field, the municipal airport, would host the 7th Ferrying Command. And then finally, a month later, the Army announced that a massive sub-depot installation would come to Great Falls to handle the massive quantities of fuel, spare parts, engines, and other supplies that the two big Great Falls air bases would need, as well as those 3 satellite bases in Montana. And with these dramatic developments, Great Falls and Montana were destined to play a leading role throughout World War II. As Lend-Lease got underway, centered on Great Falls, far more than aircraft departed for the Soviet Union as part of the Lend-Lease program. For these planes were loaded with almost 4 million tons of military and civilian goods. And buried within these massive shipments was a wide range of stolen secrets. This image shows the long route, more than 7,000 miles, for some 8,000 combat aircraft to navigate from Great Falls to Alaska to Siberia and on to the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union was desperately engaged with Nazi German forces. The U.S. Army officer in charge of expediting the deliveries from Great Falls was Major George Racy Jordan, a tough veteran of Eddy Rickenbacker's first pursuit group as a pilot during World War I and a peacetime businessman. Heading the Soviet mission at Great Falls was Colonel Anatoly Kotakov, a Soviet national hero. The interplay between Jordan and Kotakov became legend as Major Jordan revealed the extent of Soviet spying through his detailed diaries and provided evidence that during the Lend-Lease operation, hundreds of undocumented Soviets arrived and spread out across the United States with no accountability. This was the price that President Franklin Roosevelt was willing to pay and put up with to keep the Soviet Union fighting until we could build our army and get a second front opened with an invasion of France. Early in World War II, a most unconventional fighting force formed in secrecy in the mountains of Montana, and all U.S. Special Forces and Canadian Special Operations regiments that have followed are patterned after them. They're direct descendants. The first Special Service Force was formed with 3 elite light infantry regiments composed of Canadians and Americans, organized and trained in the summer of 1942 at Fort William Henry Harrison. They specialized in high alpine combat, covert amphibious landings, parachuting, and non-conventional tactics. Their mission was to slip behind German lines to create chaos while targeting and sabotaging enemy military and industrial relations. This all was born in the fertile mind of Englishman Geoffrey Pike, who was on the staff of Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, and promoted by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The force formed and prepared over 8 months of vigorous training, and of course in combat they earned the nickname the Devil's Brigade, and this image shows them marching through the streets of Helena in a farewell parade as they were on their way to Europe in April of 1943. World War II ended, and as part of the massive drawdown in U.S. forces, Montana lost the air bases at Cutbank, Lewistown, and Glasgow, although Glasgow's aviation career wasn't over. The great news came, however, that Great Falls Army Air Base would become a permanent installation as a gateway to Alaska and for northern air defense against those perceived Soviet bomber attacks. With the post-war Army Air Forces reorganization, each state was authorized one Air Guard unit. An Army investigating board toured the state and finally recommended Gore Field as the best site for Montana's Air National Guard because of all the facilities and runways that had been built up for the 7th Ferrying Command operation during World War II. The first, and of course, my book, and not today, but my book talks in some detail about the roles played by both the National Guard and the National Air Guard during the Cold War. The first dramatic showdown during the Cold War was the Berlin blockade, and it occurred when the Soviet Union closed all air, land, not all air, but all rail, land, and canal access to West Berlin. They couldn't close the air access because it had been formalized in agreement with the four powers, and they didn't think that there was any way that air could resupply 2 million West Berliners in a sustained blockade. But the blockade did go on, and the U.S., using the same leadership that had been so successful in the Lend-Lease and delivering so many aircraft to the Soviet Union, took it over and managed to fly fuel, coal, food, and supplies in for those 2 million West Berliners through that first cold winter and on into 1949. But as the blockade lengthened, it became clear that huge numbers of new air crews, new pilots, and so on would have to be trained to relieve those that had been working steadily for month after month. To do that, the U.S. Army Air Corps, no, by then it was the Air Force, 1947. The Air Force decided Great Falls, Montana would be the resupply training base for all air crews and pilots going over to participate in the Berlin blockade. So using radio beacons, Great Falls Air Base transformed to resemble Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. Hundreds of pilots and flight crews just recalled to active duty became qualified on the C-54 and on flight procedures to and from Berlin. As the duration lengthened even further, some irate citizens around Great Falls complained about the noise and air traffic. This led the Great Falls Tribune to report The constant droning of these ships overhead threatens the mental tranquility of a whole city. By this time, the importance of the Berlin airlift has waned in the mind of the average citizen. But to the people of Berlin, the beat of the C-54 engines is a song of freedom. On Saturday, the 21st of May, 1950, Montana celebrated the first Armed Forces Day in the aftermath of two dramatic national security events: the National Security Act of 1947 and the Executive Order 9981. Experiences from World War II led to that National Security Act, unifying the Department of the Army and the Navy into a Defense Department, and initiating a trend toward unification of U.S. Armed Forces that continued for many years. In addition, over the strong objection of the Navy, the act created the Department of the Air Force, effective September of 1947. The next year, in July of 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which ordered, quote, that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origins. With the stroke of his pen, this president from a Missouri family with historic ties to the Confederacy set in motion the greatest political act since Reconstruction ended in 1875. Implementation would not come easily or quickly, and it would take more than 6 years until the Army's last segregated colored units were disbanded. Several more decades would pass before the Navy and other services would come fully to grips with discrimination in their ranks. Yet Executive Order 9981 established a most important breakthrough in racial relations. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, you all, I'm sure, know about. It brought the United States and Russia, Soviet Union, closer to a nuclear exchange than any other event throughout the Cold War. From October 16th to November 20th, the world teetered on the brink of a catastrophic and very hot war until leadership and luck prevailed. The Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded through a background of escalating tensions in the Cold War, fueled by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, followed 6 weeks later by a failed summit between Premier Khrushchev and the newly elected President Kennedy, in which Khrushchev concluded that Kennedy's very inexperienced, even immature, and a weak leader. 2 months after the summit, the Soviets and East Germans erected the Berlin Wall, a direct response to the president's weakness in Vienna. Yet Khrushchev misjudged the young and experienced American president. Kennedy was a quick study and learned from his performance at Vienna, yet the Soviets did not know that, and once again they miscalculated, as they had during the Berlin blockade. In an October 1962 dramatic peacetime television address to the world, President Kennedy announced the crisis that offensive nuclear missiles and aircraft were in Cuba, and said it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in this Western Hemisphere an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. And of course, that played out through not a direct military attack on those missiles in Cuba and the Soviet aircraft, but rather by a naval quarantine to keep further missiles from coming, and also a demand that those already in Cuba be removed. So in the aftermath of that dramatic red line speech, Montana's military immediately responded with an unprecedented state of activity, according to 341st Strategic Missile Wing historian Troy Halsell. Montana Governor Tim Babcock activated the National Guard, since nearly half of the state's counties did not have adequate civil defense preparations, and only Butte had a fallout shelter plan in place. The Montana National Guard established a shelter plan, communications network, warning systems, and a radiological program for forecasting and detecting active fallout. The Air Force moved fighter planes from Great Falls to Billings Airport. Historian Halsell described the environment at Malmstrom Air Base with everyone working at a frenetic pace over the next month. And I'll skip that, but it's a fascinating account of how Alpha Flight of the ICBMs, the Minuteman ICBMs, came online at 3:07 p.m. on 27 October, many months before they were scheduled to come online, by kludging the system so that Kennedy indeed had his ace in the hole active, the Minuteman missile system, which was much more accurate and solid fuel as opposed to the Soviet liquid fueled and less accurate missiles. But it's hard to imagine today to capture the level of tension on both sides during this dangerous and dramatic period. On October 27th, just after the U.S. naval quarantine was implemented and the situation was nearing a boiling point, the most dangerous flashpoint occurred when an incident aboard a Soviet submarine, like this Foxtrot submarine in view here, stands as likely the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. The U.S. Navy destroyer USS Beale acquired a submarine on sonar and began dropping practice depth charges on that nuclear-armed Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine operating near the quarantine line. That submarine was one of 4 Foxtrots hastily deployed to Cuban waters from the Soviet Northern Fleet and had been out of radio contact with Moscow for days, knowing that war was near and wondering if it had already begun. The charges being dropped were non-lethal warning shots intended to force a submarine to the surface. But the submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, mistakenly took them for live explosives. Adding more fuel to the fire, a second Navy destroyer came on scene and began dropping unauthorized hand grenades with blasting sounds much like sledgehammers. Convinced that he was engaged in the opening round of war, the Soviet captain angrily ordered his men to arm his submarine's single nuclear-tipped torpedo and prepare for attack. The misunderstanding could have resulted in disaster if it had not been for a Soviet naval contingency measure that required all 3 senior officers on board a Soviet submarine to sign off on a nuclear attack, a nuclear launch. The Soviet captain ordered it, but Captain Vasily Adropov, not part of that submarine's normal crew, but just by happenstance had boarded before the submarine sailed. He was chief of staff of the submarine brigade at the headquarters, not part of the submarine crew. And thank goodness he was on board, because he refused to buy off on the launch. And after his strong effort was joined by several of the other Foxtrot officers, the submarine commander back down. Now, we didn't know about that at the time. We didn't know about that really until the end of the Cold War, when our relations with Russia, rid of its Soviet domination, began opening up on issues like that. So as former Secretary of State Acheson later wrote, in foreign affairs, brains, preparation, judgment, and power are of utmost importance, but luck is essential. And Captain Akrapoff's presence on board that submarine was indeed luck. In September 1963, less than 2 months before his tragic assassination, President Kennedy visited Great Falls, paying tribute to its importance in our nation's defense and for the role played by the Minuteman and the missile wing at Malmstrom during the Cuban Missile Crisis the year before. President Kennedy also paid personal tribute to his Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, by stopping by Mansfield's boyhood home on the south side of Great Falls. Kennedy, that day at Great Falls High School Stadium, gave what I believe is his finest Cold War speech, saying, "Montana's a long way from Washington, and it's a long way from the Soviet Union, and it's 10,000 miles from Laos. But this particular state, because it has, among other reasons, concentrated within its borders some of the most powerful nuclear missile systems in the world, must be conscious of every danger and must be conscious of how close Montana lives to the firing line which divides the communist world. We're many thousand miles from the Soviet Union, but this state, in a very real sense, is only 30 minutes away." Now, very curiously, he mentioned Laos at a very time when everything going on in Laos was secret, was operations being conducted by the CIA supporting the anti-communist Hmong tribesmen. And we don't have time today, but my book goes through the story of the CIA recruiting dozens of Montana smokejumpers, like Jerry Daniels from Missoula, sending them over to Southeast Asia, to Laos, in numbers. Jerry Daniels became the number one aide and confidant to the leader of those Hmong anti-communist forces in Laos, led by General Vang Pao. And the reason why Montana today has hundreds of Hmong tribesmen and their descendants living in the Bitterroot Valley goes back exactly to that, to Jerry Daniels and his home in Missoula. George Fryet, this young man, kind of unbelievably became the first prisoner of war in Southeast Asia, American prisoner of war in Southeast Asia. This happened in 1962. He was born and raised in Helena, and we don't have time to go through much of his story except to say that he was over in Saigon as part of the military aid, and he'd been educated in Russian language and some other skills, so you can imagine what he was doing there at the in Saigon. But in his spare time, he was teaching English to Vietnamese, and he was riding out on his bicycle on the fringes of Saigon when he was attacked and captured by Viet Cong. They held him for 6 months and released him, but he became the first American prisoner of war from Helena, Montana. Few events of the Cold War had more impact on our country than those of 1968. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam was catastrophic. The Navy reconnaissance ship Pueblo was captured by the North Koreans. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Chicago police attacked activists at the Democratic National Convention, while Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring anti-communist movement there. A sad year indeed. To the astronaut crew of Apollo 8, the first manned mission to the moon, late in 1968, this was their chance to close out that tragic year on a positive note, successfully entering lunar orbit on Christmas Eve. That evening, astronauts Borman, Lovell, and Anders performed a live televised broadcast from space, hoping to raise American spirits, while they showed photos of the moon and Earth as seen from their Apollo 8 spacecraft. Lovell said, "The vast loneliness is awe-inspiring, and it makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth." Their crew ended the broadcast taking turns reading from the book of Genesis. William Anders said, "For all the people on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." And then Lovell took over. And finally, Frank Borman ended by saying, "And God called the dry land earth, and gathering together of the waters called the seas. And God saw that it was good." And with that, Borman said, "And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." Toward the end of the 1990s, Colonel Frank Borman became a Montanan. He bought a cattle ranch in Bighorn County and lived many years in Billings. One of the many surprises I found as I did my research. To Colonel Frank Borman and likely all astronauts, major events in space were battles in the Cold War. One Montanan prominent in these battles was Jean Marion Eddy, a leader in the important NASA Public Affairs Office. Marion Eddy and his team played the key role in coordinating a highly successful campaign to sell the space program to the American public and around the globe. Marion Eddy was born in 1935, the only child of Italian immigrant parents who settled in ethnically rich Black Eagle, adjacent to the Anaconda copper and zinc refineries. Educated in journalism and broadcasting, Marion Eddy joined NASA as a protocol officer and rose through the ranks very quickly to take over the public appearances or public affairs branch. Marion Eddy's primary job was to get the astronauts out of their spacesuits and around the country to sell the system. Marion brought many astronauts on different occasions to Montana. As Operation Homecoming in 1973 was executed to bring back our Vietnam POWs, I was serving as the senior intelligence officer on board the USS Constellation, operating in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. With Vietnam bombing operations suspended under the Paris Peace Accords, I boarded a C-2 COD to arrive at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines before the POWs. On February 12th, I met Captain James Bond Stockdale, the senior Navy POW, and with U.S. Air Force Colonel Robinson and Reisner, the leaders of all the POWs. My assignment as Stockdale's escort and debriefer was the honor of a lifetime as we spent the next 2 months together, first for medical processing and initial debriefings at Clark, then the long trip across the Pacific and back to his home at Coronado by San Diego, California, for a detailed debriefing. The exceptional storage of courage and bravery that Captain Stockdale related to me each morning and which I transcribed each afternoon to send back to the Pentagon was so powerful in documenting his extraordinary bravery and leadership that it led to his award of the Medal of Honor. Lincoln's birthday, Monday, February 12th, 1973, that same day as I was there, was a day long yearned for and prayed for by all American POWs held in captivity in North Vietnam. On that day to remember, their release began, and the first group of POWs boarded 3 C-141s at Hanoi to fly the 2.5-hour flight to Clark Air Force Base. Arriving that first day at Clark to be greeted by Operation Homecoming, in addition to Captain Stockdale, were Montana's 2 credited prisoners of war, Lieutenant Rodney Knutson of Billings and U.S. Air Force Captain Lynn Gunther of Glasgow. A 4th POW I've mentioned previously, Colonel Fred Cherry, was also released that fateful day, the first and highest ranking black officer among the POWs. Major Cherry, then Major Cherry, had close Montana ties, having served at Great Falls Air Base, and while stationed there, had married a Great Falls woman. So skipping through Cherry's career, grew up in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, seeing the Navy and Air Force aircraft doing acrobatics as he was a boy. He determined to be a pilot, and yet the Air Force was only just integrated, and here was this African-American boy growing up in segregated Virginia. The story of how he became an officer and became a pilot is really compelling. But so too is compelling is the story after his shoot down in North Vietnam, when he was captured after bailing out, breaking his left wrist, his left leg, and crushing his left shoulder. He was near death, yet the North Vietnamese were determined to keep him alive because they wanted to extract propaganda about the racial situation in America from him. That was their goal. He was the 43rd American to be captured, the first black man to be held. And in his prison cell in the zoo, his captors assigned a young Navy ensign, Porter Halliburton, to be his cellmate, thinking white Southerner with black man will foster racial strife and they will reap the benefits. Didn't quite happen that way. Cherry, a virtual invalid at the time, would have died without Halliburton changing the dressings on his infected wounds, feeding him, bathing him, and yet without Halliburton having to feed, watch over, and care for Cherry, he would have gone into deep depression. Together, they were not men of conflicting races, but fellow Americans helping each other survive the brutal regime of their captors. The bond they formed in that dark and dirty cell led to a lifelong friendship and a very, very fine book that accounts their story, Two Souls, Indivisible. When they were separated, Cherry wrote, "That was the most lonesome night I ever spent in my life." Halliburton considered their parting as one of the saddest days of his life, adding, "I was in awe of him, and I'd learned to love him." So this photo shows Colonel Cherry standing beside his portrait in the the Gallery of Heroes in the Pentagon. "Welcome home, daughters of America," with these words that came from a Montana Vietnam veteran, Army nurse Diane Carlson Evans, who conceived the idea and fought for 10 years to bring into reality the first women's military monument in the nation's capital. Before an estimated crowd of 25,000 at the new monument site, Admiral William Crowe, who I served for in London, as a matter of fact, Admiral Crowe opened his remarks by choking back tears brought on by memories of his service in Vietnam, recalling visions of nurses as they jumped from a landing helicopter to take charge of wounded soldiers. Admiral Crowe said, "I have just seen an angel of the Lord." Young Lieutenant Carlson, later Carlson Evans, served as an Army nurse in country in 1968-69, beginning at Vang Pao Evacuation Hospital about 80 miles out of Saigon, and then at the 71st Evacuation Hospital in Pleiku, near the Central Highlands, at a time of heavy fighting and mass casualties, and where the night belonged to the Viet Cong in the spring of 1969. She returned with the other Vietnam veterans to a divided nation that failed to honor the men and women it had sent into combat in distant Southeast Asia, and that's what set her on her mission to build the monument. Over the next quarter of century to the end of the Cold War, Malmstrom Air Force Base served as a vital component in our nuclear arsenal, and Montana continues in that role today in our post-Cold War world. The Cuban Missile Crisis and the little-known Able Archer 83 exercise brought the U.S. and our NATO allies and the Soviet Union and their Warsaw Pact allies to the brink of war. That a catastrophic World War III did not happen is a tribute to both power and luck, the sobering power of the atom and the essential components of good judgment and luck along the way. As the 1970s progressed, cracks began to emerge in the Soviet empire behind the Iron Curtain, with Soviet society increasingly corrupt, its economy stagnant, and events like the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, the mutiny on the destroyer Sturozhevoy in the Baltic Sea, and the defection of young Soviet Lieutenant Viktor Belenko with his red-hot new Foxbat aircraft, all of which have Montana connections. The 1980s brought a series of new leaders to the global stage, and they began performing and improvising with one another, and the world moved forward as John Paul II, the Polish Pope, visited his homeland and was met by millions who received his message, "Be not afraid," answering Stalin's old sneer, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" with the answer of millions and millions of Poles. And of course, Maggie Thatcher, Prime Minister Thatcher, the Iron Lady, was in action in the United Kingdom, revitalizing that country and bringing it into an increased role in the Cold War. And in 1980, of course, we elected President Ronald Reagan, who called the Soviet Union what it was, an evil empire. But the Soviet leaders in succession, Brezhnev, Cherenko, Andropov, died in a 3 or 4 year period, leading Reagan to quip, "How am I supposed to do anything with the Soviets when they keep dying on me?" But fortunately, they did die, because a much younger 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev, the first college-educated Soviet leader, the first Soviet leader that would admit their economy was stagnant, their society corrupt, and they needed glasnost and perestroika and change. Not that he wasn't a Soviet communist leader, but the interaction between those four over the course of the mid and late 1980s led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and at last in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, banning communism along the way, banning the Communist Party. The wall had fallen, mutual assured destruction had ended, the mortal enemy had disintegrated, the Cold War was over. Every Montanan rejoiced, man, woman, and child. After all, every Montanan had fought in the Cold War. Thank you. There I am in my office in the USS Constellation. So, did Diane and Mike come? I don't know. I guess not. Diane Carlson Evans?
I thought that she would be here. I thought this started at 2:30.
Oh,
The information that I had said 2:30.
sorry. Yeah. I thought Diane Carlson Evans was going to be here.
Facebook